Tibet, with the government in exile saying they believe 80 people have been killed. The Chinese authorities say they've regained control of the capital, Lhasa, but the unrest has spread. The protests have come at a delicate time for China, just ahead of the Beijing Olympics.
A week of violent protest. Thousands of ethnic Tibetans on the rampage, the result of long simmering anger at Chinese rule. These pictures are from the Chinese state broadcaster, but they've not shown anything of the crackdown, which the government calls a people's war of security. Tibetan activists say at least 30 and maybe as many as 100 people are dead.
Yesterday, the Lhasa was completely under chaos and many people are being killed as reported. And similarly, the Labrang side in the Amdo and many other places, huge demonstrations have been taking place.
There's a heavy police presence, but no way to check the claims. The Chinese authorities have blocked journalists' access to Tibet and ordered all tourists to leave. This Danish visitor flew from Lhasa to the city of Chengdu.
I didn't hear any shot, but there was a big fire on the market, and I saw a lot of people with wounded head and blood, and ambulance and tanks and policemen all over.
And the unrest has spread to the city of Jiahu, Gansu province, where an estimated 4,000 people gathered yesterday near the Labrang monastery. This is all acutely embarrassing for China. They're preparing for the Olympics in August. The torch relay, which is supposed to go through Tibet, starts in just 2 weeks. There have been calls for a boycott, but at the moment that looks unlikely. China's new economic power has made many former critics wary of incurring its anger by criticising its human rights record. But this week's events have made the issue impossible to ignore. And many Tibet supporters know that China's image is particularly vulnerable just now, and they've mounted sympathy protests like these in India and New York. Beijing has blamed Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, for the conflict. The Nobel Peace Laureate has told his countrymen to avoid violence and has called on China to address Tibetan resentment through dialogue. The authorities have given the protesters until Monday to hand themselves in or face what they say will be harsh punishment. Tim Johnston, World News Australia.
Here, members of the Tibetan community and their supporters have hurled eggs and water bottles at the Chinese consulate in Melbourne. The latest protest comes as the president of the Tibetan community of Australia apologised for the behaviour of some protesters outside the Sydney consulate yesterday.
It's our country!
After years of peaceful protests, the Tibetan community vents its frustration.
I want to die in here to death!
Surging towards the Chinese consulate, one protester who made it past the police line receiving a caution. They're calling on China to renew dialogue with the Dalai Lama and to offer them genuine autonomy.
My grandparents are back in Tibet. Can't even step out of the door.
The Australia-Tibet Council wants the federal government to hold China to its promise to improve human rights ahead of the Olympics. The desperation also came to a head yesterday in protests in Sydney. Tenpa Dugdak was among 4 arrested, one man charged with assault. He says the crowd became distressed when they saw what they thought was a Chinese embassy official. The police say he was an undercover officer.
That's when a few protesters ran up to him and was shouting and yelling.
Mr Dugdak says finding out what's really happening in Tibet isn't easy. These internet pictures show a protest in Tibet's northeast, filmed on a mobile phone. He says Tibetan relatives say they can't leave the house, and he's heard reports of night raids by Chinese police.
And yesterday a lot of Tibetans here in Sydney tried to contact their families and friends in Tibet, and all the mobiles are now cut off.
And he believes landlines are tapped. The president of the Tibetan community has apologised for the behaviour at yesterday's protests. He says emotions are running so high in the community on Sydney's northern beaches that many are taking sick leave.
Also at the same time they are very scared because their members, their family members might be killed, might be imprisonment.
Mr Garden is urging the government not to be too polite in dealing with China. Cassandra Hill, World News Australia.
Chinese authorities have regained control of the Tibetan capital Lhasa after a week of demonstrations by protesters opposed to Chinese rule. The Tibetan government in exile says 80 people have been killed in the Chinese crackdown. Dr. John Powers is a China-Tibet expert from the Faculty of Asian Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. He believes the protesters in Tibet have seized on China's desire not to be seen as an overly repressive regime ahead of the Beijing Games.
Well, I think there are two things. The biggest thing, undoubtedly, is the imminent Olympic Games and the fact that, as you said, the eyes of the world are on China as never before. I also think that there are a number of signals that the Chinese government has given that they recognize that there will be protests and that they are determined to present a positive image, that is, that they don't want to appear overly repressive. And they have guaranteed that they would respect human rights. So I think that this has probably emboldened some people on the Tibetan side who hope that, well, for one thing, that they will get news coverage, and also that the Chinese won't be as repressive as before. And I think those are the two factors primarily.
Meanwhile, the ordinary Chinese person, what does he or she think of Tibet's struggle for independence?
Well, that's one of the really key factors here. I was reading an article today that was looking at blogs produced by Chinese people, basically ordinary Chinese citizens, and overwhelmingly there was confusion, disgust, annoyance at these demonstrations. That is, from the point of view of the average Chinese, they can't understand why the Tibetans are protesting. The Chinese view, which is shared across the board by most Chinese, is that China has liberated Tibet from a feudal serfdom, that it's brought economic benefits, that the Tibetans are better off than ever before. They've brought Chinese language, Chinese culture, and the Tibetans ought to be really pretty damn happy about this. And this is very much the attitude. And overwhelmingly, this is what Chinese people are saying about these protests, that they shouldn't be doing it, that they have no right.
The pro-Tibet demonstrations we've seen here in Australia, they have thus far been rather peaceful, relatively peaceful. Yet the ones we saw yesterday in Sydney and today in Melbourne, they haven't been. They've been rather emotional, verging on the violent. What do you think has changed?
I think there's a lot of frustration. We're getting on to 50 years now since the Dalai Lama fled in 1959. The first incursion of Chinese troops into Tibet was 1947. The Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile have consistently pursued a nonviolent program. They have tried to hold dialogues with China, and the Chinese government is simply not talking to them. They're not responding in any way. And they're obviously hoping that the Dalai Lama will die and that they'll have a better, they'll be better able to control things. So I think that there really is a lot of frustration, and I also think that the timing of the Olympics is important. That is, that the protesters think this is really a key time. It's been way too long. China's gotten away with far too much, and it's now time for us to really take some action.
Dr. Powers, thank you very much for your analysis there.
It's a pleasure.